For this particular topic, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to jump in and kind of show you the difference between a single bond, a double bond, and a triple bond. And I'm sure you'll catch on. So, for instance, single bond, you can tell on the final structure. I'm going to pick on C2H6. And if I draw the final structure of that, we have the two carbons that are connected together, and then we have 6 hydrogens around each carbon. And these are all single bonds. You can tell that on this structure by the fact that there is only one dash there. Now, I think I mentioned in an earlier segment in this part that each dash, I hope we're okay with, each dash represents actually 2 electrons. Okay, so those are all single bonds, but there are a pair of electrons there. Now, just for kicks, if it's okay with you, I want to kind of circle around this carbon. Okay, can you see where if I count, if each of these are 2, I have 2 electrons, 4 electrons, 6 electrons, 8 electrons. That's actually that complete octet we talked about before. I could draw around this carbon, little circle here, 2, 4, 6, 8. You know, we have 8 electrons there. Okay, but my point here is those are all what we call single bonds. A sharing of a sharing of a single pair of electrons. Now contrast that to a double bond. And for a double bond, if you're okay, I'm just going to kind of draw it here. Double bonds, I'm going to pick on C2H4. Okay, so now again we have our 2 carbon atoms, okay, but I'm going to draw a double bond between them. And then I'm going to draw the 4 hydrogens kind of scattered around, 2 around each of the carbons. So that's our C2H4. Now, I'm going to ask this in the form of the question. How many electrons, based upon what I was talking about, do you think are there in this double bond? And the answer actually is 4 electrons. And so double bonds have actually 2 pairs. 2 times 2 is 4. So there are 4 electrons there. So that's a double bond. And so just for kicks, let's go ahead and draw a little circle around, just pick on one of the carbons. And the other carbon, it's symmetrical, so it'll be the same. So if I do that, how many electrons do we have associated with this carbon? 2, 4, 6, 8. So that's where the complete octet comes in, by the sharing of 4 electrons there. Whew, that's getting pretty messy. The last one is a triple bond. So not so surprising, you're going to see 3 dashes between the atoms that are triply bonded. I'm going to pick on C2H2. So in this case, we simply have 1 hydrogen on each of the carbons. So how many electrons, question mark electrons, do you think are represented in a triple bond? Yep, there are 3 pairs, so 3 pairs means this is 6 electrons. So very good. So let's go ahead and draw a circle around either carbon, and as I draw a circle around this carbon, the other carbon will be the same. Let's count up electrons. I got 2, 4, 6, 8. I definitely have 8 electrons. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick check. Now, there actually are, whenever you see a dash, there are options here. Those dashes could either be a sigma bond or a pi bond. And so, kind of in those final structures, even if they aren't drawn, they're there. Okay, a sigma bond is what we call the primary bond. Sometimes I call it the first to arrive, first to get there, or arrive, first to arrive. Okay, so for each of these sigma bonds, and the other one is a pi bond, think of a pair of electrons. So there's just 2 electrons. Okay, a pair of electrons are being shared. That's the primary bond between the atoms. If the atoms are covalently bonded, then those pair of atoms must at least have a sigma bond between them. And they can't have 2 sigma bonds. Okay, so there can only be 1 sigma bond. It has to be there, okay, if the atoms are joined together. So what this means is that anytime you see a single bond, which was the case in the, well, we saw single bonds in all the structures we looked at, but in the first structure we looked at on the previous slide, The C2H6 had all sigma bonds. And if you're not familiar with the sigma, actually sigma, yeah, it's spelled this way. It's a Greek letter, and it kind of looks like an, and you're going to want to be able to interpret it or even draw it. It kind of looks like an O with a kind of hat. That's a Greek letter, sigma. And sigma bonds, the first to arrive, will connect those two atoms, and I'm going to try to kind of show you what this looks like. But the sigma bond will lie between the nuclei, the nucleuses, the nuclei of the atoms that they're trying to connect, that they are connecting. So I went ahead and brought a new figure in to kind of show you where the sigma bonds are. So remember we talked about, actually in this case, yeah, I like this. This carbon atom, this is the atomic orbital of the carbon atom. This is the atomic orbital of this carbon atom. And where they intersect, okay, that actually is the bond orbital. Intersect, overlap, same thing. Bond orbital. Okay, so there's are where the two electrons reside that create that. This was the one, the CC. Okay, this is the C2H6. They're all sigma bonds. So the sigma bond lies specifically between the electrons are shared, and that sigma bond, and that bond orbital, sigma bond, actually lies between, in a line between the nuclei of the two atoms. Now we can pick on any of these carbon-hydrogen bonds, but can you see actually this is the atomic orbital of the carbon atom, this is the atomic orbital of the hydrogen atom, and you can kind of see the overlap. Okay, so that's the bond orbital, and that also is a sigma bond. Okay, so you can kind of see it connecting the nuclei of the two atoms. Now you're like, well, why wouldn't it connect the nuclei of the two atoms? Well, I'm going to kind of throw in the other type of bond, chemical bond, where electrons are shared, and that is a pi bond. So you're probably already familiar with the Greek letter pi, so pi bond. Now this is the second to arrive, and it may not arrive at all. Okay, we don't necessarily have to have a pi bond for the atoms to be bonded together covalently, but we have to have a sigma bond. I like to say that the primary bond is like your meat and potatoes, and the pi bond is like your dessert. You have to have your meat and potatoes, you don't have to have your dessert. So the pi bond actually comes into account when we have our double and triple bonds. So the fact that you can only have one sigma bond connecting two atoms, if you have a double bond, the second bond must be a pi bond. So in a double bond, you have a sigma, pi, and in a triple bond, you can only have one sigma bond. So in a triple bond, you actually have one sigma bond and two pi bonds. Okay, I hope that works for you. You get double dessert. I have a figure coming up on the next slide to try to show you what this looks like, but this kind of blows people's mind, I think. The electrons that create a pi bond, every pi bond has two electrons, actually will reside in a region outside the primary or sigma bond. So it makes kind of a, like, looks like to me a hot dog sort of shape, where the hot dog is like a hot dog sandwich sort of shape, where the hot dog is the sigma bond and the bun part is the pi bond. You'll see what I mean. It's totally cool. So it looks like this. So I picked on actually a compound that this is C2H4. Okay, we have our C2 and our H4 here. And these actually are the atomic orbitals. And the atomic orbitals overlap to create the bond orbitals. And simply here then being shown is the C, there's a double bond there and single bonds here for the hydrogens, the terminal hydrogens. So this, let's see, I'll use a red, that should work. This is your sigma, 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 sigma. And this actually shown in a region above and below this sigma bond are where your pi electrons are. So this right here, let's see, how do I want to do this? I'll put an asterisk. This region right here is shown in that bond right here. There's a pi bond, and the first to arrive was sigma. I hope that helps. Okay, but do you see where, to me, that is like the hot dog bun, and this is the hot dog? Oh, anyway.